Hello and welcome everyone to the premiere episode of the New Media and Contemporary Culture series in the summer semester 22-23. It's the first time we're doing this in a hybrid mode, so please excuse any problems, technical or otherwise. This semester's edition is a truly exciting one. We have three amazing and, more importantly, renowned experts in digital, new media, culture, literature. And our first speaker is Professor Astrid ENSSLIN. Hello, Astrid, how are you?
Hello, I'm very well. Thank you for inviting me, Bartosz. And thanks to everyone for coming.
Yeah, exactly. Welcome, people in the classroom. Say hi. Yeah, and to everybody in front of their computers, tablets, and mobile phones. Astrid is a kind of household name for everybody doing research in digital fiction, but by dint of formality, I will read a kind of a biogram of Professor ENSSLIN. So Astrid ENSSLIN is a professor of digital cultures and communication at the University of Regensburg, adjunct professor of digital humanities and game studies at the University of Alberta, and a research associate for the Center for Digital Narrative at the University of Bergen. Her most recent books include Pre-Web Digital Publishing and the Lore of Electronic Literature, and the Digital Fiction and the Unnatural Transmedial Narrative Theory, Method and Analysis. Her new monograph with Alice Bell, Reading Digital Fiction, Narrative, Cognition, Mediality, is scheduled for publication with Routledge in summer 2023. The subject of her talk, sorry, I will let in one more person on Zoom. Okay. The subject of Astrid's talk is the ambimedial reader in VR, Empirical Insights. Astrid, the virtual floor is all yours.
Yeah, thank you so much again, Bartosz. And I will go ahead and share my screen. I hope you can see this now. Hopefully in full view, full screen view. So just as a little preface, Bartosz, I just wanted to thank you as well for putting together this particular program, comprising scholars that I've been working with almost throughout my career, and in a way, I'm not sure what exactly each one of us will be presenting on. I mean, Lyle might be taking a slightly different path, but Alice might as well also talk about our empirical research. So it's going to be quite cohesive, I think, or it might be even. So it's, I'm really, really glad that we are coming together in this way, in a more linearized fashion. So in this talk, I'm going to present an element of my empirical research, which, you know, is in a larger context of empirical reading, or, you know, digital fiction reading, that Alice and I have been developing over, quite a few years now. And so here I'm looking at medial reading in virtual reality fiction. So I'm asking questions like, what does it even mean to read medially? How do readers of VR fiction process and engage with medial references and the material and the spatial contingencies they experience in an experimental work that remediates and transmediates a plurality of media technologies? What does it even mean to read in VR? And what can it look like? How can the design influence the way in which we see ourselves in the world and in relation to the characters and the plot and so on? So to begin with, just a brief note on what digital fiction is. I assume many of you in the audience are already quite familiar with it, but, you know, just to be on the safe side, a digital fiction is digital born. It's fiction written for and read from a computer, online, offline, standalone, you know, across different technologies and protocols. But what's really important is that you can't print these works, or you can't fossilize them in any kind of way, because they are inextricably bound up with the medium, with the platform they were made in and for. They can be transmediated with print, of course, but when you print them, you basically kill them. You kill the effects and the experience. So these works can be text-based, multimodal, ludic, playable. It depends. It really depends on the technology and on the aesthetic. But we tend to look at works that are experimental, that really question and break traditions that are produced in a non-commercial, most of the time anyway, in a non-commercial kind of context. What's key as well is that we as readers we basically produce the story world and plot, or co-produce it by interacting with the work. So it's a non-trivial kind of interaction. So this element of being written specifically for the digital medium also means that it's inextricably linked to the affordances of the platforms and technologies these works are made for and in. So every analysis of digital fiction and its reading needs to take into account these affordances. Yeah? So this is the idea of medium specificity or media specificity that Kate Hales already talked about in print is flat, code is deep, like about 20 years ago. But now it's becoming more manifest in empirical research. So here you have some typical, genres or types of digital fiction, like hypertext fiction, web-based multimedia fiction here in the middle. And these type of works are often used or typically produced using HTML5, CSS, JavaScript, or more historically speaking, like Flash, like more obsolete technologies, Flash, QuickTime. Then you have here interactive fiction or like app fictions for tablets and smartphones, but also video games, that I call literary video games with a strong narrative and sort of poetic expressive component. You have social media fiction, AI-based fiction, which is of course, proliferating at this point, but also narratives created in augmented, mixed, and virtual reality. Digital fiction readers, they tend to make choices, not always, but in most cases, I would say, they tend to make choices about their journey through the text or story world. For example, by following links or by responding to textual or visual prompts from the work. Digital fictions are, if you're more familiar with electronic literature, yes, they are a type of electronic literature. So ELIT is an umbrella term that comprises many different experimental verbal art forms across platforms and aesthetic styles. So unlike more poetically or more sort of conceptually oriented forms of ELIT, like generative, kinetic, hypertext poetry, for example, digital fiction offers primarily narrative experiences with a strong emphasis on plot, character, setting, and narratorial functions. Digital fiction seeks to explore new medium-specific and transmedial forms of narrative expression and engagement, and therefore simultaneously continues and disrupts the history of prose writing, the novel and the short story. So when we talk about how we study digital fiction, we can see like four different waves of DF scholarship. The first wave accompanied the first generation of hypertext fiction, like back then, like in the late 90s or 90s, I would like mid-late 90s, early 2000s, where scholars utilized post-structuralist theories to make sense of what they saw, So we're talking about death of the author and readerly text, the Barthesian ideas, or the decentered text, Derrida, rhizomatic writing, Deleuze and Guattari, or fluidity and intertextuality, put forward by Cixous and Kristeva. So these types of concepts were deployed to conceptualize hypertextual forms and their associated readerly effects. But what also happened was that readers were often placed in a binary relationship with print. So here is print, this is like this, and here is, you know, hypertext. And hypertext was seen to be like liberating, liberating the reader from, quote, the tyranny of the line, as Coover put it in the early 90s. Second wave scholarship then followed with more systematic approaches, like, you know, the body of digital fictions was gradually increasing, and so, you know, the need arose to make sense, you know, to create typologies, to create methods, systematic and replicable methods of analyzing individual texts. So there was a shift towards these sort of methodologies, and they focused, and still do focus, on, say, the linguistic, the narratological, multimodal, interactive, ludic elements in digital fictions, and because this kind of scholarship often utilizes theoretical models and analytical frameworks from cognitive narratology and stylistics, there is, of course, this inevitable disciplinary focus on the reader's relationship with the text or the fictional worlds they construct. But these readings, like these analyses, were, you know, researcher-centered, or still are. You know, they were not, or they have not been, like, empirically tested or something like that. So that's what is happening in the third wave. And here scholars seek to empirically investigate digital fiction reading by collecting and analyzing reader responses to digital texts, digital fictions, using qualitative and quantitative collection and analysis methods. And these studies are informed by embodied cognition, like cognitive sciences, cognitive narratology, and stylistics. A fourth wave, like, just you know, as a side note, a fourth wave that's been emerging over the past sort of 5 to 10 years is what I call applied DF scholarship or research, and it tends to align itself with the principles of critical making as a digital humanities paradigm. So here, groups of interdisciplinary researchers and artists are working together with the community to create works that are made specifically for certain groups of society, certain needs, like, you know, issues that they have, like, you know, environmental issues or body image, things like that. And so the idea is, like, to create almost like a game for change, except that it's actually a digital fiction. It can have, of course, ludic elements, like always. So the project I'm presenting today is firmly anchored in the third wave, but of course partly draws on achievements and some analysis from our second wave work. So what I'm presenting today is an offshoot of the Reading Digital Fiction project, which ended in 2017, like funded by the AHRC and initiated by Alice Bell and myself. And so one of its main aims was to explore and develop new empirical literary methods to examine reader engagement and interaction with digital fictions, and to understand and inform transmedia and cognitive narratology with new medium-specific insights. So in this work, in the sort of, you know, funded period, we looked at how readers conceptualize and process hyperlinks in hypertext fiction, how they see themselves vis-a-vis various forms of textual you, like, you know, second person narration and address, and how they perceive and switch between different types of immersion in 3D immersive fictions and more like 3D game worlds. And this, what we're doing today, what we're looking at today, is a later project that I did with my group in Bergen, but of course with the input of Alice as well. And this all together, the studies together, will be published in a monograph out with Routledge later this year in summer, called Reading Digital Fiction, Narrative, Cognition, Mediality. So let's look at our methodology for a moment, just to generate a context. So in our empirical cognitive reader response methodology, we draw on Marissa Bortolucci and Peter Dixon's psychonarratological distinction between textual features on the one hand and reader constructions on the other. So textual features are the kind of objectively observable elements that we see in a text, right? And constructions, reader constructions, are what readers make of them. So that they are kind of mental images or mental processes that manifest in their discursive responses to the text. And these discursive responses can be, evoked individually, or they could be jointly negotiated, say in reading groups that are then turned into focus groups. But it's important that, these constructions are used as data, right, for analysis. As far as empirical methods are concerned, we use what Swan and Allington present as two opposing paradigms, like experimental versus naturalistic approaches, where experimental studies aim for maximum experimental controls, testing hypotheses. They often use quantitative methods in tightly controlled settings like labs with a researcher present. Many also involve manipulation of text, say like to isolate individual features and to be able to compare like with like, because as you can imagine, like in these multilinear texts, nobody reads the same text in the same way. So how do you then compare like with like? That's what a more controlled study, experimental study can systematize a little bit. So methods would involve interviews, questionnaires, text comprehension tasks, Likert scales, eye tracking, right? So this kind of bundle. Naturalistic studies, on the other hand, they are after like maximum ecological validity, So texts are presented in their original form, and they use readers' discussions about these texts in their usual environments and minimize researcher intervention. Sometimes you have the researcher completely removing themselves from a discussion, just placing an audio recording device or something, right? Other naturally occurring data would, for instance, include online reviews or forum discussions on the internet. Both paradigms can be combined, right? And that's exactly what we did to be able to address specific research questions in a targeted kind of way. And both have, of course, advantages and disadvantages. So overall, we adopted the reader response approach advocated by Whiteley and Canning, where text and data are given equal weight. So you need the text, of course, it's the prompt, and you then need the data. However, Whiteley and Canning focus on print, as many others do, would have done. And our point is to reiterate that is really to emphasize the medium-specific nature and the importance of focusing, including that in any data analysis of reading. So crucial to our analysis is then this medium conscious, typology. We have used an existing typology called the discourse model of reading by Peplow and others, which has these different response types. Okay, readers tend to respond to a text in 3 different ways, at least in this print-derived theory. Mimetic, like relating to sort of an outer world reality or sort of actual world reality, for instance, social problems or something like that. Then it could be a thematic, which is something the text is about. Now, what is this text trying to tell us, kind of thing? And then synthetic is in relation to specific textual features, stylistic features, formal elements. And Field and Rabinowitz suggest, and that's a plausible, argument, that specific genres, types of fiction evoke or lead to certain types of responses as a trend, right? So so-called realist fiction tends to be dominated by mimetic interests. I'm quoting, allegories and political polemics stress the thematic. The nouveau roman and much postmodern metafiction put priority on the synthetic. However, again, there isn't very much in the way of medium specificity. So how does the medium affect our responses? And of course, readers also refer to the medium, even book readers do. And so this is something we want to contribute to this debate. So as I indicated earlier, reading digital fiction is a very diverse phenomenon that includes PC and console-based reading, reading from tablets and smartphones, augmented mixed VR, and so on. And each technology comes with its own spatial, situated, and material parameters. Now, it's like standing up, sitting down, moving around, just holding something in our hands, sitting on a computer, keyboard, everything is significant, right? So this is an element of embodied cognition and practice. So the starting point in our book is therefore the centrality of mediality, for any investigation of reader response. So we've pioneered third wave digital fiction scholarship by investigating the medium-specific ways that readers cognitively process digital born fictions. But we would expect that this approach works for other fictional media as well, except that I think it needs to be done. Still needs to be done. Medial responses, then, just to remind ourselves, as an additional category that we add to Phelan's and Peplow's tripartite response taxonomy, medial responses then account for an audience's interest in, awareness of, and/or attention to the medium in which a text is produced and received. This includes affordances inherent in the technologies used and their site-specific embodied implications for reader interaction. Medial responses are related to synthetic readings, as responses that refer to the formal qualities of a text, but still distinct, right? Because the medium tends to change, right? When we think of formal or say stylistic devices, they tend to be textual, right? So using language. So media are a lot more flexible once you bring them in. Yes. So another thing that's important is that responses of the different types of responses, they interrelate, they overlap, they inform each other, so they cannot be seen in isolation. Through our data analysis, we have then refined the concept of medial response and derived 3 subcategories, which are necessitated by the medium and context-specific nature of the text under investigation. So, number 1, automimetic responses. So think of a reader who reads a text like The Princess Murderer, right? Like this is a hypermedia fiction, and you constantly read about you, and you're not quite sure who you is. It could be me as a reader, it could be a character in the narrative, it could be, I don't know, something completely different, so someone completely different. And so we tested them, readers, for how they see this you. And so an automimetic response is one that reflects upon one's own role or self-image in a text that encodes the reader like this. A parasocial response, then, that happens when we communicate with a character in world. It doesn't happen very often, like as a direct communication, but Alice's study on Karen, the app fiction Karen, does this. So we basically communicate with Karen, who is fictional, directly, and that has some kind of a bleed effect, which is here called parasocial. And people really build this relationship with Karen over time, and it's quite lasting as well. So you could say it's a subcategory of a mimetic response, right? Like which relates to real world phenomena. And then third, and this is what I want to focus on today, ambimedial responses. So those are ambivalent and ambient. Like, that's some kind of combination. And these types of responses relate to the reader's trans and multimedial references as they attempt to describe or reconcile an unfamiliar medial experience. They try to come to terms with it by referring to more familiar media experiences. But ambimedial also refers to the embodied nature of the response, and as we will see in specific works, the ways in which different worlds, ontological spheres are created and experienced, like Ambi being in different ontologies. I'm referring to that. So at the beginning of this study, it took us several weeks to actually find a VR fiction that matched our criteria for digital fiction. So it had to have a strong experimental narrative component, an emphasis on character psychology, a focus on reading, or at least giving us a sense that we are reading, not watching or playing exclusively. So here we found a work that actually remediates literary devices like books and other written and printed documents. The Book of Distance by award-winning, it is an award-winning work by Canadian Japanese media artist Randall Okita. It was produced by the National Film Board of Canada. And I guess you could describe it broadly as an interactive, animated, immersive storytelling experiences that uses conventions of stagecraft, cartoon, traditional Japanese art, but many other media as well. And it places us in the biographical context of Randall's grandfather, Yonizo, who was separated from his family and kept in an internment camp with many other Japanese Canadians during World War II. So I'm going to play a brief trailer to you just to give you a sense of just how rich this experience is. Of course, it's 2D. It's very different when you experience it with Quest goggles on or something.
The Book of Distance is a room-scale, virtual reality experience about my search to know more about my grandfather.
Randy, I think that he was 15.
No, he was 18 when he came here.
No, like he was 15.
Are you sure?
The project combines layers of documentary and imagination, archival documents and magical theater to provide a platform for our questions and a guide to our speculation. It can be easy for history to feel abstract. In this project, we embrace the idea that engaging with our histories can be an act of imagination, that it could be participatory, alive, and physical. We used experience with the mediums of film, theater, sculpture, and interactive installation to inform each phase of development and design. We developed two styles of visual language. One was the photorealistic layer of archival documents that included letters, photographs, and government notices which the audience could take, open, interact, and connect with. This layer represented the facts we knew, the dates, the policies that were enacted at the time. In addition, we had the language of imagination. We chose an art style that evoked theater and mechanical sculpture, that included transforming, hand-painted sets that announced to the audience that for reasons of censorship, erasure, or uncertainty, these are the parts of the story that we're creating. I get lost at this point sometimes. I don't know how to show this moment. Images of the camps were controlled and my grandfather refused to talk about what happened. Through identifying our attempts to fill in the gaps of knowledge and putting our process of creation on display, we're inviting the audience to join us, to become our partners in telling the story. In this way, engaging with a history that we know to be true can still become participatory, active, imaginative, as the audience works with us to fill in the details around the things we know. I also make myself visible as an author of this work, but also as a participant in the learning, someone trying to make sense of this history and how it lives in me today. I think this approach allows the audience to connect to the meaning behind the actions they are taking and the situations being represented. The actions of taking pictures, opening letters, planting seeds, and feeding the family has the opportunity to resonate as an act of memorialization, an attempt to understand, or to become closer to a historical moment. In this way, the audience becomes a part of the telling of this story and part of a performance that assigns meaning to what happened then, in some ways to what happens next.
Okay, so I'm gonna, just explain the narrative a little bit and to draw attention to certain aspects that are important to our study. So on this slide, you can see the main characters of the work: Randall, his dad, his grandmother, his grandfather Uniso, young and grown up, and Uniso's sister. And at the center, you see Randall, the narrator, who kind of assumes the role of a stage director. He mediates between different historical periods, different spaces, different generations, and importantly, he also establishes a metaleptic connection to us, the reader, in the diegetic space, or narrative, if you will. An unusual aesthetic, as you can see, are the faceless faces, right? So these have an elliptical function and remind us that Randall had to reconstruct, most of his grandfather's memories through what he calls acts of imagination. The narrative starts with a conversation between Randall and his father, who you see here at top right, who acts as a narrator interlocutor to evoke the memories of Uniso, which the work revolves around. The father also occurs throughout the flashbacks as a child with his sister. An important element of the work are the interactive scenes, and many involve the readers taking photographs, as we've heard, of imaginary family scenes, and these are evocative of the photographs that are embedded as archival materials. The interactive episodes create an important link between the non-fictional documents and the author's auto-fictional constructions, or allofictional, if you will, like being a biography, or sort of a fictionalized biography, but not about yourself, but another family member, for example. So some of the key scenes of the work are depicted here. Across the top, you can see the young Uniso person, like a character on his voyage to Canada, where he met his wife. So it was an arranged marriage, and they built a strawberry farm from scratch. They had 2 children and, led a simple but happy life until 1942, when the Canadian government began to forcibly relocate and intern over 22,000 Japanese Canadian citizens from British Columbia, i.e. over 90% of the total Japanese Canadian population, in the name of, under the suspicion of espionage. Like many others, Uniso's family was separated, their farm and belongings stolen, literally, and Uniso was taken to an internment camp. Our results are specifically meaningful in the context of the scene I'm going to show you very briefly, which immediately precedes Uniso's crossing of the Canadian border.
Careful, just take a step back. This place is an act of imagination. It's an idea. Do all places start like this?
So
careful, just take a step back.
You could see he draws this chalk line right in front of us, the viewer, in world, almost pushing us aside to mark a boundary between different ontological realities, right? Between Canada, not Canada, right? Japan and Canada, I guess, before and after Uniso's emigration, but also between us and the intradiegetic world that Randall constructs for us. And in this process, we become acutely aware of our role as onlookers. Now, despite the fact that we physically seem to follow Uniso across the border, and we even have to show our passport, we're given a passport, before stepping through the gate. So despite this in-world interaction, we never really lose our ontological distance to Uniso's world and his suffering throughout the story. We're not allowed to become Uniso, right? Rather, we retain our voyeuristic stance. And that's a really, really important element of the design. So just a brief word about the empirical setup. The study was conducted at Bergen University. We had 15 participants, staff and students from digital culture, media arts, and game studies. They started by answering a media exposure questionnaire, and they did a full playthrough, a 30-minute playthrough of the work, followed by a semi-structured interview, immediately followed by it. We video recorded the sessions, but only used the audio data to transcribe and then code in NVivo. And the coding happened in terms of themes like general VR experience, spatial impressions, types of empathy. So the study as a whole was mostly dedicated to empathy, but that's a different paper. And they also had to, in the interview, they answered questions about who they felt they were in relation to the characters, and that was coded as well then. So let's talk about ambimedial reading and how that, can be derived from the data. So when we think of reading in VR, we can describe it in a variety of ways. Firstly, and maybe most obviously, reading can refer here to the deciphering of letters on a remediated page or surface, which happens frequently in the Book of Distance, and sort of ranging from notes on postcards and boards, captions in photo albums, to entire letters and government documents. And medium-specific reading of such traditional written documents in VR also involves haptic interaction, right? So we can touch, pick up, turn around, throw, and shift written documents in this 360-degree space. And it kind of approximates the qualities of reading in a very rudimentary way, but it also transforms it. It's different. It's defamiliarizing, right? So that's one thing. And in a broader, multimodally more inclusive sense, reading in VR is also multimedial, intermedial, transmedial. Written language is only one of many audiovisual, animated, procedurally interactive, and spatio-temporally organized media embedded and therefore intertextually referenced in the work. And all these medial sources need to be decoded, right? Individually, but also together in semiotic clusters. Reading in VR can also happen transmedially, right? So in complementary ways. Think, for example, of the scene, there's a scene after the internment camp scene where we can pick up and read governmental letters addressed to Uniso, and they tell him that his property and all his personal belongings have been disowned and resold. And this information is then combined with the 3D animation of the family working in a field, and there's a voiceover of the narrator saying that this was essentially forced labor and that Uniso had been deprived of many of his basic human rights. So together, right, and across media, like the story is being told. But beyond this more generic observation, we also found that readers read medially in at least 3 more ways. So intermedially, so intermedial processing, which we define as sense making in terms of other media, and then ambient contingencies, which are a function of the environmental, situational, and personal embeddedness of the reader. And they are non-trivial. They really shape the experience as a whole and the understanding of the text. And ambi-spatial orientation. Now, so this is basically an aspect or almost like a reversion of presence in VR that directly affects the reader's relationship with the characters and the story as a whole. I will explain what exactly that means. So intermedial processing. In response to our questions about the nature of the VR reading experience, we observed a greater than expected variety of references to other media. So prompted and unprompted, people talked a lot about other media. 140 instances we got in total. So they, of course, those who had experience with other VR works referenced those in comparison. That makes sense. But what was maybe most striking was that they most often described their experience in terms of print media, like books by Japanese authors they had read, visual novels, or even one mentioned a pop-up book that I can control. So it felt like that. Many participants who refer to filmic media likened the linear on the rails experience. Like it feels like, you are constantly moving along rails. And that felt a bit like watching a movie without having agency, right? You can't really shape the plot. But they also distilled an important difference to cinematic viewing. This sense of distance, right? Cinema moving, watching movies tries to take away the fourth wall. It tries to convey a sense of immediacy. Here you have a distance, right? That happens partly through character design, but also one mentioned the metonymic representation of us, of our bodies in world, where we only see our arms, right? And that felt kind of alienating because you can't see anything else, just your arms. There were also references to performance arts, like theater, stage, costume drama, role play, pantomime, opera. And Matthew, who was a theater lover, explained that the work, quote, put me in the seat. I was standing up, but it was a red velvet theater seat. So that's where I was. Interestingly, you might have heard that Randall Okita himself labels his work as magic theater, and closest to that came Paul, who explained that, quote, it was like a theater production. I mean, it felt like that to me, especially in the beginning. He was like this magician, here is this thing. And Paul also referred to the paintbrush, which you can see, like, and interact with as a magic wand. Other strong associations were with museums and other exhibition spaces. They actually mentioned specifically the Jewish Museum, but other places as well, where you can see traces and belongings of people who were disowned, displaced, murdered. For instance, in Seattle, which is actually exactly that community that the narrative refers to. One participant referred to the experience as illustrated radio, so a new coinage, if you will, because of this very linear narrative with presentational moments where the audio track is the anchor, but then, quote, you have these graphics that illustrate what's happening. The ambient contingencies are basically, elements that strongly shape the reading experience, that are physical constraints, elements of the design, and so on. So, think of the spatial boundaries, the guardian boundary. Whenever that was transgressed, it really felt like, people were being made aware of the room, of course. Like, so some participants reported that they were always aware that they were doubly embodied. So they didn't really feel fully immersed. And that the VR equipment actually increased their awareness of their surroundings rather than pulling them into the world 100%. And that contradicts a lot of existing research on VR, immersivity, and so on. The interactive elements received very mixed responses. Like, most readers struggled with the controls, especially the camera click, and there's a horseshoe mini game, which you can't really win. And some found the interaction unnecessary or even disruptive. Others, however, enjoyed having them, and some emphasized that they really liked the camera and the paintbrush controls because they reinforced or kind of reflected their role in the world, like their onlooker status, right? So that there was an element of narrative cohesion. And then participants' individual situatedness in life really plays a part, right? Especially when it comes to appreciation more generally, and being able to come up with an emotional response. So the photographer amongst our, I mean, there was a a lady who was a photographer. She just loved the idea of taking pictures or having a migrant background. Some of our participants had that with similar traumatic memories that reinforced the connection, even when there was a second generation situation. Being fond of Japanese culture helped immersion. Having lived near the setting of the story, as one of our participant had done, he'd actually seen the camps. He showed an extremely emotional response. So all these things play a significant non-trivial part in making sense. And then finally, something that has not been documented really at any length in my understanding anyway, but that is directly related to the chalk line effect here, is what I would refer to as ambi-spatial orientation. And that was felt like a sense of absence in presence. That's like a paradox. So Kate said, when asked, so who were you in relation to the characters? She said, I was the person who wasn't there. What Judith said, like, it was weird because you just feel you're kind of both there and not there. Carl said, like, I'm in the same space, but there's a distance. Or Matthew, I couldn't act. I wasn't there, right? Although he was literally acting, like enacting certain scenes. So, yeah, we thought that was very interesting because they quite decisively referred to this spatio-ontological paradox in a way that suggests that presence isn't necessarily felt as diegetic presence, but as some kind of metafictional condition that places us in an imagined space between intra and extra diegesis, the interlocutive space of the narration. And so in cognitive narratological terms, you could call this dual embodied metalepsis, right? So it's the transgression of or oscillation between different ontological realms. One between the world of Uniso, right? And then the world of the narrator Randall on stage and ourselves as counterpart, as fictionalized audience. And then, of course, our own physical world as readers experiencing the VR work. So just to wrap up, media reading in VR goes way beyond reading remediated documents in a re-embodied way or reading between semiotic modes and respatialized multimedia. We also read ambimedially, taking into account the ambient contingencies that make up our readerly situatedness. Now we read intermedially, trying to make sense of the experimental unknown through cross-references to our own media experiences, but also by creating new, hitherto unrealizable concepts like illustrated radio or, say, walkable pop-up book. Finally, specific aesthetic stage designs like the chalk line in the Book of Distance can draw readers' attention to the illusion of full immersion and create a variety of diegetic layers and ontological spheres that evoke paradoxical effects like absence in presence. And this effect can also show us just how outrageous and in a way unethical the claim of VR being an immersive empathy machine is, right? We can never be Uniso, nor will we ever fully grasp or even begin to grasp just how much pain and suffering he went through. But what we can do is we can honor him and other survivors by keeping, yet simultaneously questioning the critical distance that this work conveys to us on so many levels. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm going to stop the share. Yep.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Right. Many thanks, Astrid. Okay, let's open the floor for discussion. Any questions? People in the room? People in on Zoom?
Is the vocabulary that was used newly coined? Because I googled some of the terms and they weren't there.
I'm sorry to say that. Don't say that. That's true.
No,
The-
it's newly coined, right?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay, that's why there's not much on it yet.
But yeah. Yes. It's kind of brand new, so to speak.
Oh,
Yeah.
so we're like sneaking into something very like new and just kind of rising.
Yeah. Exactly.
Wow.
Yeah. 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 The question is from like, how can I paraphrase this into a question? Hey there. How can I make it to the question?
How what?
How can I put it in a question to our speaker?
I mean, I would say that like maybe are the terms newly coined or
Mhm.
I don't actually know how to ask this question. I would perhaps maybe say, are those things like already existing or like it's like new process
Okay,
happening, like
okay.
we're in the middle of the research.
Okay.
So
Okay.
like,
Okay. All right. So Astrid, the question is, I suppose, the question is, to what extent would you contextualize the research on VR in the context of literary studies in general and digital literature in particular? I think like the question that I would sort of take from that is, for example, the empirical research within the traditional print literature in relation to empirical research in VR or digital fiction. How would you contextualize your and Alice's research within more general general reader response research?
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's a great question. So our main contribution is that we we draw attention to the importance of bringing the medium into the analysis of reading. And I mean, people talk about different experiences. They talk about the plot, the characters. They talk about the meanings of a work. They talk about how a text is constructed. But what we find problematic, and that's the context, and that's where we're coming in, problematic is that the medium is kind of erased. It's kind of taken for granted. And most studies, at least, to our knowledge, work on print, like reading groups that read novels, print novels together. So that's something where, and I think there was also a question about the terms and the, new concepts. We have to create new concepts because these experiences have not been documented or studied empirically before. So how do you then make sense of it? You can make sense of it just in terms of print. It just doesn't work like that. And that's why in almost all of our publications, you find at least one new concept, because we're looking at a medium that also renews itself all the time, right? It's part of this avant-garde experimental portfolio or agenda that you try, or these artists try to make it new, like modernism, like trying to make it new every single time, breaking patterns, breaking technologies, and overriding them in new ways. You can even see the history of the novel in this way, right? The novels that are sold, as popular media, popular sort of novels, they follow certain genre traditions, but the novel as a literary medium or literary genre has always tried to make itself new. And so I hope that answers your question a little bit, but that is basically the context where we come in.
Okay, great, thanks. Okay, if no questions from the room, maybe Melina.
Yes, thank you. First of all, thank you so much for your very interesting talk, and also the organization. Thank you for making this hybrid so I could be present. I have a practical question and possibly a little bit of a silly question. So I teach an MA course on cognitive narratology, and my students have to do an empirical research on narratives. And this year I introduced video games, so they worked on The Witcher. And I'm thinking of maybe introducing VR next year. So here comes the silly part. I get quite ill when I use VR. So I was wondering if you had encountered participants who also got that notion of motion sickness. I think that is kind of what happens for people who play VR. If so, how did you deal with that? I was thinking of maybe you have like these bracelets that work for motion sickness, maybe introducing those, or so I was wondering, yeah, whether you encountered that and how you dealt with that.
Yeah, great question. The bracelets don't work. I tried them on my boys. I mean, they may work with some people, but not across the board. That's my experience with them. But yeah, you're right. And that's one of the major issues we have to flag when it comes to VR. VR is not a one-fits-all technology. No technology is, but in VR, it comes to the fore very strongly. I mean, it was, you know, these devices, they were designed with male bodies, like male Western able bodies in mind. Women tend to have like thinner bodies, smaller bodies, or just people who are not that built in that way. They will find the headset just very heavy after a while. And yes, the dizziness is something that a lot of people report. Also, when you have a disposition towards epilepsy, you need to check everything, and with all your students, participants, because if they are epileptic, they should not do this. They should not do any. I mean, there is no strobe effects in this particular work, but still, you know, better safe than sorry. So yeah, and that's why we think it's maybe one of the most embodied technologies out there for fiction, and yeah, and it's not the same for everyone. Yeah, but just as a note of caution, maybe do a little survey with your students before, or, you know, don't expect them all to even get through the whole work. Yeah, it's a little difficult, and also when it comes to designing participant study, you have to then just rule out some data, you know, discard it because it's not usable in this way, or, you know. But I mean, I would say like 90% of the people we approached to become participants actually had an experience that was worthwhile for themselves, and that yielded data that we could use in the study.
So really just do a checklist of, okay, do you have epilepsy? Are you prone to to motion sickness?
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you.
Right.
Okay, Anna now.
Thank you so much for this very inspiring talk. As a digital fiction enthusiast myself, and coming from intermedial studies, I can't even start unpacking what you just said. So I have just a couple of questions. First, it's regarding, again, probably the terminology you use. You keep referring to this experience of interacting with this type of media as reading. And is there motivation behind that? Why do you stick to this concept? And the second one is regarding this, the illusion of immersion, because I was struggling with this myself, because we're kind of used to using the concept of immersion as being involved in the story. And when we say that this illusion breaks away, we are no longer involved in the story. We we look at the story from a rather meta level. And I think it's very much incorrect, because there is a difference between still being immersed in the story and being estranged from it at the same time. You still can be interested in what is happening in this world, and at the same time you can still be this absence and presence. You can still be aware that this is something you detached from. So how do we account for this, I don't know, paradoxical relationship? And so,
right.
Yeah, thank you so
and
much.
That's exactly what it is. It is paradoxical, and you may call this a literary effect of this particular work. It doesn't try to hide its own illusory, you know, nature as far as immersion goes. Because when you wear these headsets, there's always a little crack at the bottom through which you can, and you also want to see your environment, because otherwise you may lose, you may lose balance or whatever. So it's actually quite important for your safety, your feeling like of being safe in the space as a reader. But it really, the fact that it really, it's so obvious, it really draws attention to this, which doesn't necessarily happen in other reading experiences. So, but you asked about reading, and we've been talking about this question ever since we started this research. What is actually happening here? And then we came up with sort of hyphenated terms and terms with slashes, like reader, player, user, viewer. And at some point you just grow tired of it, and you realize that reading is this. This is reading nowadays. It can be many things, but it can also be, experiencing a VR world with or without written text. You still read it, right? And it evokes intertextual frames and so on. So, and that's what we argue in this book. Let's just call it reading. And it's in line with new literacy research that also, brings in different media as literacies and they have to be combined to make sense and contribute. So the medial reader, that's what we bring out in this book. Yeah, so illusion of immersion. I think you're absolutely right, because you can have both, because you still pay attention to the plot and what's going on. Not with all people, though. We had a couple, like one in particular, who really, really disliked the experience. And when he had trouble clicking the camera button, he said he almost gave up, and and he was actually one that knows these kind of media really well. He just felt that was not good enough. So that really broke the immersion for him, and he kind of went through it because he felt he had to. And most of the others, though, kept an element of illusory, of this feeling of being present in absence, or absent in presence. So yeah, it's something worth, highlighting, problematizing, going into as a literary effect. Yeah, great question. Thank you.
Thank you. And the question from Elżbieta.
Hello, thank you. I will also like to thank you very much for a very wonderful and interesting talk. My question is quite simple, namely because you showed here VR, you showed also at the beginning of the talk some examples of hypertext fiction, of the visual novels, and so on. My question is, what do you think the future of digital fiction is going to look like? Because I'll just explain briefly. In my experience, it's actually still quite niche, I would say. A lot of people also don't realize they are even interacting with digital fiction, take, for example, app fiction. It's also not necessarily something that is often, for example, translated or shown in other countries. So if we have digital fiction in America, it rarely makes its way, for example, to Europe. And if it does in a sort of very strict, I would say, museum environment. At least that's what I observed. So what do you think the future holds for digital fiction? Do you think it will still become something, continue to become important, or will it just stay on the sidelines?
That's a great question too. So I'm, as Bartosz said at the beginning, I'm an affiliate of the Center for Digital Narrative at Bergen University, and their focus is in particular how artificial intelligence will shape the future of narrative, poetry, you name it, literary arts. And what then happens if we can just use a version of ChatGPT to literally generate all these works without any knowledge of coding? This is happening, and it's putting digital artists and poets into a life crisis. Like all the work that they've done over time and like all the codes that they've developed are now, replicable and designable just by an AI. Although, yeah, I mean, it's not entirely creative, right? It's always a reflection collection of existing data, existing code, and so on. So you can argue this point, I guess. But I think the future will be partly or significantly shaped by our interaction with, intervention in AI-generated narrative. That's how I see it. I also hope, because I'm a humanist, I hope people will still keep making digital fiction without the influence of AI, or at least like influence in the sense of, you know, relying on it. It just critical engagement with it. That's what I would be interested in personally. And then your other question about sort of the culture specific nature of it and the niche phenomenon. Yes, I agree. I look at China, for example, the sort of Okidian model, where Chinese professional authors have been producing web novels, a bit like sort of Wattpad style, like, you know, like they actually make enormous amounts of money. So it's no longer an avant-garde, or it never has been in this way, an avant-garde phenomenon. So you are absolutely right. I think it becomes a more multicultural field, already has been over many years. What people in India do and study as digital fiction and ELIT has overlaps, but it's also very culture specific there. I mean, I've just I have an article with Samia Roy coming out next month about that. It's becoming more interesting, and you know, I would not deplore at all the niche character. It needs to be niche, but that does not rule out that more mainstream commercial forms like games, like narrative games, can also be studied from a digital fiction experimental perspective, right? So I think I wouldn't look at it in a black and white way, in any kind of way, but it's rather make it part of an area studies approach, right? So how does it look in different parts and different groups of society, different parts of the world, without ever even attempting to essentialize, right? Like that's why I'm always a bit careful of this area studies approach. But yeah, long story short, this is becoming very, very diverse, even more diverse every year. So yeah.
I see. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And I look forward to your publication in the summer. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks. Anybody else?
I guess
Yes.
I had a question about intermedial processing, and whether I was wondering whether it's something which is inherent to VR as a media, or is it something that as VR establishes itself, it will go away and it will become, or it will not need references to other forms of media anymore?
Okay.
Yeah, great. That's also a great question, which we keep asking, and it's not exclusive to VR. You know, when we play games, we also, you know, any medium that is not normalized as something that with clear boundaries and something that we know from traditions and things like that, we tend to understand in terms of what we know. So it's not VR specific, but in this particular work, it really becomes a prolific territory for comparison, and not just comparison with existing media, but also a creative field where readers invent new concepts, media concepts that were previously unthinkable. So that to answer your question about that. And yeah, the other part of the question I've kind of lost track of. What was that? Can you just repeat that for me?
Whether this intermedial reading is something inherent to VR, or whether it will go away as it establishes itself.
Oh, well, as it establishes, yeah. I mean, if you can never say it will establish itself, because VR, being a simulative medium, may constantly stretch the boundaries of what's possible in media terms. So VR may just really become another world for us within which we experience the media we know and new media, right? The problem is we can probably no longer just essentialize VR. So this is what VR is. It's not. It's always different, and especially in this more avant-garde experimental field. So yeah, I mean, film and even games, I guess, can be described in terms of a list of affordances or, you know, medial features, interactive features. In VR, I mean, yeah, you can always describe in terms of the technology and your interaction with the hardware. That will, depending on the technology you're using, probably stay quite stable. But then you have VR worlds or VR environments where you have nothing. You just enter a cave or something, right? How do you then describe that? So, I mean, long story short, I think it will remain a marked medium for a while, especially as new forms evolve in it, new genres, new experimental forms. Yeah, something to keep looking out for and studying, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are nearing the end, so I would just take the liberty to ask the last question. My question is, like, exploring a number of VR fictions, what would you consider as more conducive to VR presentation in terms of a theme? Like you mentioned that the Book of Distance is in a way an exercise in empathy. Are there any subjects or themes that are more more readily presented in a VR mode than other subjects or themes?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it's space and different notions of space, like physical space, imaginary space, mediated space, because we experience it spatially, embodied experiences. I think, yeah, those are coming from a narrative angle. That is something that needs to be systematized, I think, or we looked in more detail. Time is always part of space, so maybe look at the chronotope. Look at how characters get designed. And I mean, what fascinated me really in this work was the shifting between diegetic boundaries and how easily that can be done with characters that take different roles and are represented at different ages, and then they take different roles depending on which version of them is looked at. And also our angle, as we shift it, we may miss certain things in the narrative if we're looking the wrong direction, the different direction. The idea of light, where does the light fall, right? So these stagecraft elements that I'd never seen instantiated so compellingly before, you know. How can the stage, like choreography, things like that, and the physical elements of performance be remediated and in a way, taken ad absurdum, right? So renewed, refigured. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Astrid, many thanks for agreeing to speak today to us and for your fascinating talk. And thank you everybody for being here and to being there in the Zoom space. Okay, have a good day.
Can I just say thanks to Alice as well for being here and for just being an awesome collaborator.
Thank you. Likewise.
Looking forward to your talk in May, right?
Yes. In May. So take care, everybody. On the 14th of April, we have Flyle's Canes. So 11:30. Make sure you are here. Okay. So again, take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Take care, everyone.